The day the council shed human blood, they sealed their own annihilation. The vote was already over by the time I walked into the chamber. I know that. Now I did not know it then. Then I still believed in the process. I believed in the long table, the translators, the careful language, the slow and dignified grinding of diplomacy. I believed because I had been trained to believe the same way. Soldier is trained to hold a line even when the line is already broken. You keep believing because stopping hurts too much. My name is Moravos. At the time of the Accord vote, I was 31 years old, a former combat sergeant who had been reassigned to the human diplomatic mission on Vareth Prime 18 months. Earlier, my official title was Senior Security Consultant. What that meant in practice was that I stood near doors and looked serious while people far above my rank tried to get other species to take us seriously. We were not very good at it, the getting taken seriously part. The Galactic Accord had existed for 412 years before humanity ever set foot on Vareth Prime. It had 47 member species. When we arrived, ranging from the ancient and slow-thinking Dravathi who had been in the Accord since its founding to the Solon who had joined just 60 years prior and still wore their membership like a new coat. They were not quite sure fit. Every species at that table had a seat, a vote, a flag, and a formal designation in the Accord Charter. Every species except one, humanity, had been granted observer status 11 years before I arrived. Observer status meant we could attend sessions, we could submit written proposals, we could speak during the designated public comment period, which lasted exactly 9 minutes per session and was scheduled immediately before the lunch recess when half the delegates were already mentally gone. We could not vote, we could not introduce legislation, we could not invoke the Accord's mutual defense clauses, we could watch, we could speak into a void, we could be grateful for the privilege. Ambassador Conrad Lane had spent 6 of those 11 years petitioning for full membership. He was a patient man. He had a talent for patience that I had always found quietly remarkable because I did not share it. I had watched him sit across from species that spoke to him the way a teacher speaks to a slow student, gently, slowly, with a kind of practiced sympathy that had nothing to do with actual respect. He never flinched. He thanked them. He resubmitted the petition on the day I am describing. The petition had been submitted for the 22nd time. I was standing at the back of the observation gallery when the session opened. The gallery was a curved row of seats above the main chamber floor, separated from the delegates by a wall of clear composite material that was technically not glass but felt like glass and served the same symbolic purpose, close enough to see far enough to know your place. There were 14 other humans in the gallery that morning. Clerk's assistants, 2 junior attaches, who were barely older than 20, and a communications officer named Owen Burrell, who had been with the mission longer than anyone and had developed the habit of bringing a small paper notebook to every session, which he filled with careful observations in a handwriting so small I had never been able to read it. Owen was writing when I sat down beside him. They moved the vote up, he said, without looking at me. By how much? An hour and a half. It started before we got the notification. I looked down at the chamber floor. The delegates were already mid-discussion. I could see Ambassador Lane at the human observation table below. A separate table off to the left, slightly behind the main arc of delegate seats, positioned in the way. That furniture is positioned when someone wants to include you without including you. He was sitting straight, hands flat on the table, watching the central speaker with the expression he wore when he was working very hard to feel nothing. The central speaker was High Delegate Soren of the Calvari, who was the current Accord shareholder and had been for the past 3 years. Calvari were tall, slow-moving, pale-skinned beings with elongated skulls and an elaborate system of facial coloration that indicated social status. Soren's face was deeply marked with a dark pigmentation of the senior caste. He spoke in the Accord's formal tongue, which the translation system rendered into my earpiece as a measured, slightly flat voice that somehow always sounded like it was reading from a document. The matter before the chamber, the translation said, is the petition for full membership status submitted by the human delegation of Sol. The chamber has reviewed the submission. The chamber has reviewed the supplemental materials. The chamber has reached its determination. I watched Ambassador Lane's hands. They did not move. Determination of the chamber is as follows. Humanity, as represented by the Sol Collective, does not at this time meet the full criteria for Accord membership as defined under Charter Article 9, specifically with regard to the stability metrics and the conflict resolution index. The petition is declined. Observer status is maintained. The petition may be resubmitted no sooner than 18 standard months from this date. That was it. No debate, no discussion. The vote had happened before the session. This was the announcement. I heard someone behind me exhale very slowly. I did not turn to see who. Owen Burrell stopped writing. He looked down at his notebook for a moment, then closed it with the kind of care something you do not want to damage. He put it in his jacket pocket. He looked at the chamber floor and said nothing. I looked at Ambassador Lane. He was still sitting straight. He gave a single nod, the way a person nods when they are acknowledging information rather than agreeing with it. Then he reached forward and made a small mark on the paper in front of him. I could not see what the mark was from where I was sitting. I thought about it for years. Afterward, the stability metrics, by the way, referred to the fact that humanity still had regional conflicts on Earth, and in 3 colony systems. The Accord considered any internal conflict disqualifier for full membership. I had done the research. Of the current 47 member species, 31 had been admitted. While still engaged in internal conflicts, 6 had been admitted while in active wars with other member species. The Calvari themselves had been admitted during a civil war that had lasted another 40 years after their membership was formalized. The criteria were not the point. I knew that. Lane knew it. Every human in that gallery knew it. The criteria were the language they used when the real reason was something they did not want to say out loud. The real reason, as best I had been able to piece it together across 18 months of careful listening, was simpler than any charter article. It was this: they were not sure what we would do with a vote. We were unpredictable. We were fast. We recovered from damage in ways their medical models had not anticipated. We grieved loudly and then went back to work, which several species found deeply unsettling. We had a history of conflict that stretched back to our earliest written records, and Yet we kept building things, kept expanding, kept arriving at tables and asking to be included. They did not know what to make of us, and when you do not know what to make of something, the safest move is to keep it at a distance. I understood their reasoning. I did not forgive it. After the session ended, I walked down from the gallery and found Ambassador Lane in the corridor outside the chamber. He was standing alone, looking out through a wide observation window at the city of Verith below. The city was a beautiful thing. The Kelvari, built in smooth organic curves, everything rounded and pale and deliberate, their spires rising in slow arcs against a sky that was a shade of amber green that I had never got fully used to even after a year and a half. He heard me approach and turned slightly. 18 months, he said. Yes, sir. He looked back at the city. The stability metrics were being penalized. For conflicts in systems, we settled, part because the Accord's own trade corridors made expansion necessary. No, I'll prepare the resubmission. He said it quietly. He said it the same way he had said it 21 times before, like a man who has decided that the 23rd time might be different, not because the evidence supports it, but because stopping means accepting something he is not willing to accept. I stood beside him and looked out at the amber-green sky. Far below, a transport vessel was moving between the city towers, its lights blinking in a patient, steady rhythm. I remember thinking, this is what they see when they look at us. Patient lights in the dark, harmless. Waiting, I did not know then how completely wrong I was about us. 3 days later, the resource reallocation decree passed the chamber with 38 votes in favor. It was a sweeping piece of Accord legislation that reorganized the distribution of certain critical materials across contested space. In practical terms, it stripped the human colony systems of their right to maintain independent defense installations in 6 key sectors. The Accord would provide security. The decree stated the Accord would ensure protection of all recognized populations in the affected zones. Observer populations, the fine print noted, were included in the protection framework at the discretion of the regional security coordinator, subject to resource availability, subject to resource availability. Owen Burrell wrote that phrase in his small notebook and underlined it twice. I saw it when he flipped to a new page. He caught me looking and said nothing, just turned the notebook face down on his desk. Ambassador Lane filed a formal objection. The objection was logged, stamped, assigned a case number, and placed in the review queue. The review queue, I had learned, moved at approximately the speed of continental drift. In the mission common room that night, I sat with Owen and 2 of the junior attaches, a young man named Philip Adler and a woman named Caroline Marsh, who had joined the mission for months ago and still had the slightly stunned look of someone who had not yet fully accepted where they were. We ate the packaged food that tasted nothing like food and drank the hot, bitter drink that served as coffee in the human quarter of Verith Prime. Nobody said much. There was not much to say that the day had not already said more clearly. Philip Adler, who was 23 and had studied Accord law for 5 years before coming here, said the protection framework is unenforceable. If something happens in one of those sectors, the coordinator can cite resource availability and do nothing and technically be in full compliance with the decree. Nobody disagreed. Caroline Marsh looked at her. Cup, have we told Earth Command about the decree? An hour ago, I said. She nodded. She did not ask what Earth Command had said in response because Earth Command had not said anything yet. Earth Command was quiet in a way that I had begun to notice over the past several months, not absent, not unconcerned, quiet in the particular way that something becomes quiet when it is paying very close attention. I went to bed that night and lay in the dark for a long time. I thought about the vote that had already happened before we were notified. I thought about the petition. 22 times submitted, 22 times declined. I thought about the fine print subject to resource availability. I thought about the window in the corridor and the amber green sky and Ambassador Lane looking at it with the expression of a man who had decided patience was his only remaining option, and somewhere in the quiet of that thought I felt something shift. Not in the room, in me, a small specific shift, the kind that happens when something you have been calling hope quietly reclassifies itself as something else, something cooler, something that does not need the 23rd petition to go any particular way. I do not know what to call what I felt. It was not anger. Anger is hot and loud, and it wants to be seen. This was different. This was the feeling of paying very close attention. I fell asleep thinking about Earth Command silence and found somewhat to my own surprise that it did not bother me anymore. That was the moment, I think. Looking back, that quiet reclassification in the dark, that was the beginning of everything that came after. I just did not know it yet. I will describe what happened on Cath Station the way a doctor describes a wound, clearly without decoration. Because the facts are enough, I was on the station because Ambassador Lane had sent me ahead of the main delegation to review the security arrangements for a routine supply transfer. KTH Station was a human civilian hub, the largest one. The outer sectors, a sprawling spinning structure that housed approximately 14,000 people, families, mostly workers, in the resource processing facilities, children born on the station who had never set foot on a planet, teachers, medical staff, maintenance crews, people who had built their lives inside a metal ring orbiting a dim star in a sector the Accord had just placed under the discretionary protection of a regional coordinator who had, I would later confirm, 4 patrol vessels and a paperwork backlog that stretched across 3 administrative years. I arrived on KATH Station on a Tuesday. The attack happened on a Thursday. The species responsible were called they were not an Accord member. They were a mid-tier expansionist civilization that had been testing the edges of human controlled space for 2 years, probing and retreating, the way something does when it is trying to find out what the response will be. The resource reallocation decree had given them their answer. The response apparently was going to be a regional coordinator with 4 patrol vessels. A backlog. I was in the station's secondary operations room when the proximity alert sounded. I had been reviewing the transfer manifests with a logistics officer named Roy Callum, heavy-set man in his 50s with the tired patience of someone who had been doing his job correctly for 30 years and had stopped expecting anyone to notice. Roy heard the alert and looked at his screen and said in a very flat voice, "That's not a scheduled arrival." He said it the way you say something you already know is the worst possible thing in our trying to give yourself one more second. Before it becomes real, I crossed the room in 3 steps and looked at the screen. There were 9 vessels. They were not Accord ships, they were not human ships, they were moving fast in formation, and they were not broadcasting any identification signal, which is the kind of thing that happens either by accident or by intent, and nothing about this was accidental. Roy reached for the station alert panel. I was already on my communicator to the ambassador. What followed is not something I will recount moment by moment, not because I cannot, but because that is not the kind of account that serves any useful purpose. You do not need a minute-by-minute record. You need to understand the scope. The attack lasted 4 hours and 16 minutes. Of the 14,000 people on KTH Station 921 survived. I know that number the way. Know my own name. I have known it every day since. The regional coordinators. 4 patrol vessels arrived 3 hours and 50 minutes into the attack. 2 of them were immediately disabled by the Vreth ships. The other 2 broadcast a formal request for the Vreth to withdraw, which the Vreth ignored, which the coordinator later noted in his incident report as a compliance failure on the part of the attacking force. Compliance failure. That was the language used. I spent most of those 4 hours moving. That is the only way I know how to describe what I did. I had a sidearm and a radio and approximately 30 years of training, and I moved through that station from one crisis to the next, doing what could be done, unable to do what could not be done, trying not to calculate the difference. Roy Callum stayed at his operations console for all 4 hours and 16 minutes and coordinated the evacuation of 6 of the station's residential rings with a kind of steady, unremarkable competence that nobody would ever write a tribute to, because he survived and survivors are not commemorated the same way. I will note it here because it deserves noting. There was a woman named Helen Marsh, no relation to Caroline, who ran the station's medical bay. She was 54 years old and had been on KATH for 11 years. She organized a triage operation in the main corridor of Ring 3 that handled more than 200 people in the first 2 hours, working with whatever she had, which was not enough but was what existed. I passed through her corridor twice. Both times she was calm in the precise way that people are calm when they have gone past the point where panic is useful and into the place where the only thing that helps is moving your hands. I did not speak to her. There was no time. A child named Lily Kerr, who was 8 years old, was found in a maintenance corridor 7 hours after the attack ended. She had hidden herself behind a conduit panel and had not moved until someone called her name. She told the recovery team that a man she did not know had told her to hide there and had sealed the panel from the outside. They never identified the man. His name is not in any record. These are the things I think about when I think about Kath Station, not the 4 hours and 16 minutes, not the breath shifts. These things. Roy at his console, Helen moving her hands, the unidentified man, little Lily Kerr behind the conduit panel, the 4,759 people who did not survive. I returned to Vareth Prime 6 days later. Ambassador Lane met me at the landing pad himself, which he had never done before. He looked at me and said nothing. I looked back at him and said nothing. We walked inside together in silence. The mission had already received the Accord's formal response. It had come through in under 24 hours, which was the fastest the Accord had moved on any human-related matter in 11 years. The response was a 12-paragraph document. It expressed condolences. It called the attack a rag. Greet. It announced the formation of an investigative committee which would convene within 90 days and deliver its findings within 18 months. It noted that the Accord's protection framework had functioned as designed in that the regional coordinator had dispatched available resources in response to the emergency. Available resources as designed. Lane had printed the document and left it on his desk. I saw it when I walked past his open office door that first evening. It was sitting in the center of the desk, and he had drawn a single straight line under the words as designed with a red pen. That was all. Just the line. I sat with Owen Burrell in the common room that night. He had his notebook open but was not writing. He had the look of a man sorting through very large filing cabinet in his head, trying to find the right drawer for something that did not fit anywhere. There will be a meeting tomorrow, he said. With who? Lane and the senior staff, and a transmission from Earth Command. I looked at him. Earth Command called in, reached out this morning. They want a full briefing. He paused. They already have the casualty figures. They had them before we did. I sat with that for a moment. Earth Command had a long reach and a lot of monitoring capability, but the speed of that was still notable. It meant they had been watching KTH station, possibly watching it for a while. Did they say anything else? Owen turned his notebook over in his hands. They asked Lane one question. They asked how many times the membership petition has been declined. I felt the hair on my arm rise slightly, which is a physical thing that happens to me sometimes when a pattern becomes visible. What did he say? 22. And what did they say back? Owen was quiet for a long time, long enough that I thought he was not going to answer. Then he said, they said they had expected it would take less. I did not sleep well that night. The meeting the next morning lasted 3 hours. I was not in the room for all of it. I was brought in for the security assessment portion, which covered the current state of the 6 sectors affected by the resource reallocation decree and the likely behavior of the breath following the attack. I gave my assessment honestly and completely. The breath would almost certainly probe again. The 4 patrol vessels had not deterred them. The investigative committee would not deter them. Nothing currently in place in those sectors would deter them, because the thing they had learned from Cath Station was that the cost was acceptable. That was the core of my assessment. The cost was acceptable from their perspective because nothing had yet demonstrated otherwise. Lane thanked me and I returned to my post. I found out later what was discussed in the second hour of the meeting, the hour I was not in the room for. Owen told me in pieces over several days in the way that he told me things he had decided I needed to know, but was not yet sure I needed to know all at once. Earth Command's transmission had included a question and a statement. The question was the one about the petition. The statement came after it was this: Earth Command was initiating a full inventory and positioning review of all human military and defensive assets across every sector, colony and transit corridor. This was being classified internally as a routine maintenance Audit, it was not a routine maintenance. Audit, the formal name in the internal document Owen told me was the beginning of the count. He said those words and then he looked at his notebook. I asked him what it meant. He said, I think it means they are no longer planning for one future. I think it means they are planning for more than one. I sat with that. I had been a soldier. I understood planning. I understood the difference between planning to keep peace and planning, because peace was no longer the only expected outcome. Did Lane know this was coming? I asked. Owen considered the question carefully. I think he has known for longer than any of us that the petition was not really about the petition, and I think he has been hoping in the honest part of himself that he was wrong. Is he still hoping? Owen closed his notebook. Ask him yourself. I did eventually, not that day. Several weeks later, when things had settled into the particular kind of quiet that follows a disaster that has not yet decided what it is going to become, I found Lane at the observation window. Again, the one in the corridor outside the main chamber. It was late. The corridor was empty. The amber-green sky outside was dark. The city of Verith lit up in long, soft curves of pale light. I stood beside him and looked out at the city. After a while I said, do you still think the 23rd petition will be different? He was quiet for a long time, long enough that I counted the lights on one of the city's far towers, slow and patient, blinking in their steady rhythm. Then he said just that. One word, no anger in it, no grief. Exactly, just a man releasing something he had been carrying for a very long time and deciding he did not need to carry it any further. What happens now? I asked. He turned from the window. He looked at me with the expression of a man who has sorted through everything in his filing cabinet and found that all of it eventually leads to the same drawer. Now we stop asking, he said. He walked back down the corridor toward his office. I stayed at the window. The city spread out below me in its beautiful, in different curves, all pale light and amber dark, and I thought about Roy Callum at his console and Helen Marsh moving her hands and the man whose name is not in any record, and 4,759 people who would not be going home. I thought about the phrase as designed. I thought about subject to resource availability. I thought about committee that would convene in 90 days and report in 18 months, and I thought about Earth Command, quiet and watching, conducting a routine maintenance audit. That was not a routine maintenance audit, counting something that had not yet finished being counted. I pressed my hand flat against the composite window. It was cool. The city on the other side did not notice. I stayed there for a long time. Then I walked back to my room, sat at my desk, and began writing my own account of KTH Station from memory in full detail, because I decided it was important that someone write it down who had been there, someone who would not use the words regrettable incident, someone who would use the actual numbers. I wrote until my hands hurt. When I finished, I read it back once. Then I encrypted it, filed it, and went to sleep. I slept well that night, better than I had in weeks. I did not fully understand why at the time. I understand now. It was because I had stopped waiting for someone else to do something about the weight I was carrying and had started deciding what I was going to do with it myself. That is, I have come to believe, a very human response to a very human problem. We do not put things down easily. We are not built for it, but we are very, very good at deciding what to do next. The 90-day committee clock started ticking. Nobody on the human side was listening to it. 6 months after KTH station, the human mission on Varith Prime was still exactly where it had always been, to the left of the main chamber, slightly behind the delegate arc at the table. That included without including. Ambassador Lane still attended every session. He still filed objections when the Accord acted against human interests. He still used the public comment period, all 9 minutes of it, with precision and without wasted words. From the outside, nothing had changed. From the inside, everything had. I noticed at first in small things the way the junior staff walked, purposeful in a way they had not been before, with less of the tentative quality that comes from working in a place that keeps reminding you that you are a guest. The way meetings ended, faster decisions made, more cleanly, fewer conversations about what might be possible and more about what was already being done. The way Lane read his transmissions from Earth Command in the mornings, still careful, still private, but with a stillness in his face that was not the stillness of patience. It was the stillness of someone who was fully informed. Caroline Marsh, the junior attaché, who had arrived with the stunned look of someone new to the mission, had lost that look entirely. She had been reassigned to the communications division after Kath Station, and she had taken to the work with a thoroughness that I found quietly impressive. She was monitoring all breath activity in the 6 sectors, now cross-referencing it against Accord response patterns, building a picture with methodical precision. She came to me one morning with a report she had put together on her own time outside of her official duty. They've moved twice more since the station, she said. The document on my desk, both times in Sector 4, both times they stopped before the threshold for a reportable incident under Accord guidelines. I looked at the report. They know the threshold. They studied it. There's a consistency to the probe distances. They're always just under the line, which means someone gave them the line. She met my eyes for a moment. Neither of us said what we were both thinking, which was that the Accord's own operational guidelines were publicly accessible and had been since the reallocation decree was published. The breath had not needed anyone to give them anything. The Accord had published its own tolerance thresholds, and the breath had simply read them. I passed Caroline's report to Lane, who passed it to Earth Command, who acknowledged it with a brief reply that said, "Confirmed, continue monitoring. Count is at 71%. I read that last sentence 3 times. I had heard the phrase "the count" from Owen before, but this was the first time I had seen it with a number attached to it. 71% of whatever was being counted. I found Owen in his office and told him what the message had said. He nodded slowly. He picked up his pen, turned it over in his fingers. "What's being counted?" I asked. He set the pen down. He looked at me with the expression of someone making a decision about how much to say and arriving at the answer of all of it. "Ships," he said, "every human military vessel, every defense installation in every colony, every emergency response unit and supply, cache and communication relay. Earth Command has been running a full audit since the week after the station. They're not just counting. They're repositioning, moving assets from positions that were optimized for Accord cooperation into positions that are optimized for something else. For what? For not needing the accord. He paused, for not needing to ask anyone's permission. I sat down in the chair across from his desk. Outside his window, the amber-green sky was doing what it always did, which was exist, beautifully and impersonally, entirely unconcerned with the things happening beneath it. Does Lane know the full scope of what Earth Command is doing? I asked. He knows enough, Owen said. He was told what he needed to know to make the decision he made. Which decision was that? Owen looked at his notebook. He opened it to a page near the middle and turned it so I could read it. The handwriting was his usual small, careful script at the top of the page. Underlined decision point Lane. Below it 2 lines, 22 petitions, Carth Station. Below that 2 words, stop asking. I looked at it for a long moment. That's what he told me at the window. He told Earth Command the same thing officially the day after. That conversation is what authorized the count a move from 50% to 71. I thought about that sequence. I thought about Lane at the window saying no in that flat-released way of his, and realized I had been present at a decision point. Without recognizing it, he had not just been releasing his own hope, he had been authorizing something. What happens at 100%? I asked. Owen did not answer immediately. He let the silence sit for several seconds, which was his way when he was choosing words that needed to be exact. At 100%, he said, the human sphere has the capability to operate entirely independently of the Accord's security framework. Every colony protected, every transit route covered, every communication relay under human control. At 100%, we no longer need to be at that table to be safe. And what does Lane do then? Owen picked up his pen again. He wrote something at the bottom of the page slowly and deliberately, then turned the notebook back to face himself so I could not see it. He stops going to the table. Owen said the Accord for its part was not idle during those 6 months. High Delegate Sorin introduced a second major piece of legislation, the Transit Corridor Management Act. It was presented as an efficiency measure, a reorganization of the FTL transit corridors that connected colony systems across Accord space. In practice, it imposed new protocols on ships using any corridor within the Accord's defined boundaries, including after a small amendment that was added in the final drafting session. Corridors currently used by human shipping on routes between colony systems. The amendment required all non-member vessels using restricted corridors to obtain transit authorization from the regional coordinator's office. The processing time for transit authorizations was listed as 12 to 30 standard days. Human colony supply runs on those routes took 2 to 3 days. Lane filed an objection. The objection was logged, stamped, assigned a case number. Caroline Marsh came to me 2 days after the act passed and laid out what a 12 to 30-day authorization process would mean for the outer colony supply chains. It was not theoretical. She had modeled it against the current supply schedules for 7 colonies. For 2 of them, the disruption would be serious within 6 months. For one, a small colony called Edris, 40,000 people in a resource extraction settlement on the edge of Sector 6, it would be acute within 3. I put a report on Lane's desk. He read it. He looked up at me. For the first time in 18 months, I saw something In his face that was not patience. It was not anger either. It was something narrower than anger and far more specific. Get me a full transport manifest for Edris, he said. Current stock levels, consumption rates, the works. I had it on his desk in 4 hours. He spent an evening with it and the next morning sent a transmission to Earth. Command, I do not know exactly what it said. I know it was short, I know, because Owen told me later that it was 14 words long. He would not tell me what the words were, but he said that after Earth Command received it, the count moved from 71 to 88% in 11 days. 11 days, whatever Lane had written in those 14 words, Earth Command had moved fast. The Thern delegate VTH was the one who came to me. He found me in the corridor outside the mission secondary conference room on a Wednesday afternoon, 3 weeks after the Transit Corridor Act passed. Though they were a mid-sized species, roughly human proportion, with skin that shifted color in bands depending on their mood, blues and greens for calm, yellows and reds for agitation. VTH was mostly blue-green when I first saw him that day, which I had come to understand meant he was composed but deliberately so, like someone holding very still in rough water. He spoke the Accord's common tongue. My earpiece translated. I would like to speak with you informally, he said. I looked at him. He had an honest face as far as I could read the faces. He had voted against the reallocation decree. I had pulled the voting records after the decree passed because it seemed important to know who had objected. 11 delegates had voted no. VTH was one of them. All right, I said. We walked not to any office or formal space, just the long outer corridor that ran the perimeter of the mission building, the one with windows on the city side. We walked slowly and he talked. He said he had been watching the human mission for the past several months, not officially, personally. He said that in his experience, which spanned 40 years of Accord service, he had watched many species respond to being marginalized. Some withdrew, some became combative and were further marginalized in response. Some simply accommodated, slowly adjusting their expectations downward until they no longer expected anything at all. Humans, he said, we're not doing any of those things. What are we doing? I asked. He was quiet for a few steps. His skin shifted slightly, a brief edge of yellow in the blue-green, then back. You are very still, he said, and you are very busy. Those two things do not usually happen at the same time. When they happen at the same time, in my experience, it means something is being prepared. I kept my face neutral. I was good at that. The chamber does not see it, he said. High Delegate Sen does not see it. They look at your ambassador and they see a patient man who has lost again and will come back in 18 months with another petition. They look at your mission and they see a manageable situation. He paused. I do not see a manageable situation. What do you see? He stopped walking. He turned to look at me directly. His skin was fully blue. Green again, fully composed. I see a species that has been told in very clear terms what this institution thinks of them and what it is willing to do about their safety, and I see that species deciding what to do with that information. He held my gaze. I have tried to raise this in chamber. I have been told I am overreading a period of human diplomatic quiet. Maybe you are, I said. Maybe I am, he agreed. He did not believe it, and neither did I. I asked him what he wanted from this conversation, and he said nothing. Specific, I wanted to say it to someone who would understand what I was saying. He paused, and I suppose I wanted someone to know that not every voice in that chamber is the same voice. I thought about his 11 colleagues who had voted against the decree. I thought about him alone in a chamber of 47, watching something that nobody else was willing to watch. I know that, I said. And I meant it, he nodded. His skin shifted briefly to a warmer tone, not yellow, not agitated, warmer in a different way, something like being heard. He walked back toward the main Accord complex. I watched him go. I reported the conversation to Lane that afternoon. He listened to the full account without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. VTH, he said. Yes, sir, remember that name I already had. 3 weeks after that conversation, Earth Command transmitted the count update. Owen came to my office at 6:00 in the morning and knocked once and opened the door without waiting, which he had never done before. I looked at him. 100%, he said. He stood in the doorway for a moment, holding his notebook, looking at me with an expression I had not seen on his face before. Not quite relief, not quite readiness, something that was both of those things and also something else entirely. The expression of a person who has been watching a horizon for a very long time and has finally seen the thing they knew was coming appear in the exact shape they expected. He said, the meeting is this morning. The meeting that morning was different from every meeting that had come before it in the life of the human mission on Vareth Prime. It was different in 100 small ways that I will not list, because what mattered was the one large way. Lay walked into the session that afternoon. He took his seat at the human observation table to the left slightly behind the arc. He sat the way he always sat, straight, hands on the table. He listened to 40 minutes of Accord business, routine matters, coordination, protocols, a minor border adjustment, the outer sectors. Then High Delegate Sarin opened the floor to the public comment period. Lane stood up. He spoke for exactly 9 minutes. He did not waste a single word. He said that the human mission was formally requesting one final review of its membership petition. He said that the petition had been submitted 22 times and declined 22 times, and that each decline had been accompanied by criteria that were inconsistently applied and had become increasingly difficult to distinguish from permanent exclusion dressed in procedural language. He said that the resource reallocation decree had placed 14,000 human civilians at risk. He said that 4,759 of them had not survived. He said that the Transit Corridor Act was creating a supply chain risk for 11 colony systems, with acute risk to 3 of them within 6 months. He named the colonies. He named the numbers. He did not raise his voice. He said that humanity was requesting full membership with all associated rights and protections, effective immediately, and that this request was accompanied by documentation of every decision the Accord had made in the past 11 years as it pertained to human populations, every outcome of those decisions, and the full casualty record of KTH Station in detail with names. Then he said the human mission would like this matter resolved before the next session. He sat down. Chamber was very quiet for a moment. Then several delegates began speaking at once, and High Delegate Sarin called for order, and the session continued in the Way Accord sessions continued, which was with great procedural noise and no particular urgency, and the public comment period ended, and Lane gathered his papers and he left. I was in the gallery. I watched him walk out. I looked at the chamber below me. I looked at the 47 delegates returning to their business. I looked at VTH of the Verne, who was sitting very still, his skin careful, composed blue-green, watching the door through which Lane had just exited. I put my hand against the gallery wall. It was smooth and cool. The next Accord session was in 18 days. I thought about what Owen had said. He stops going to the table, I thought. About 100%. I thought about Lane's voice, even and precise, reading those 4,759 names into the formal record of the Galactic Accord. 18 days I left the gallery and went back to the mission. There was work to do. The Accord's response to Lane's final address arrived in 11 days, not 18. It was delivered through official channels at 6:00 in the morning, Ver Prime Standard Time, in a sealed document bearing the formal stamp of the Accord Secretariat and the personal seal of High Delegate Sorin. It was 6 paragraphs long. The petition, it said, had been reviewed in an expedited emergency session. The review had found no new grounds for reclassification of humanities membership status. The request for immediate full membership was denied. The Accord expressed concern about the confrontational tone of the address made during the public comment period and encouraged the human mission to return to constructive dialogue. It noted that the next regular petition window would open in 14 months. 14 months they had moved it back. It had been 18 months at every previous denial. They had moved it back to 14 months, and I could not tell whether that was a softening gesture or whether they simply had not noticed the distance between what that number meant to them and what it meant to us. Lane read the document at his desk. I was standing in his doorway when he finished. He set it down. He looked at it for a moment with the expression of someone examining something closely, not out of interest, but out of the habitual professionalism of someone who finishes things properly, even when they are already finished. Then he straightened in his chair and said, "Get me Owen and Caroline. My office 30 minutes. I found Owen in the communications room and Caroline at her monitoring station. They both came immediately with the kind of readiness that meant neither of them was surprised the meeting was happening this morning. We sat in Lane's office. Lane stood. He did not pace. He stood in one place, which was how he moved when he was being very deliberate. He said, "Earth Command authorized me this morning to move forward at my discretion. I am doing that now." He looked at each of us in turn. "We are withdrawing from the session schedule. Effective today, the human mission on Verith Prime will not attend Accord sessions in any capacity. We will not file objections, submit requests, or participate in any procedural process. Under Accord authority, we will maintain this facility and continue communications with Earth Command. We will continue normal operations here." He paused. "That is all I am authorized to tell you at this time. What happens next is above my clearance to explain in detail. What I can tell you is that Earth Command has been very precise with me about the timing. When things move, they will move quickly, and they will be visible. Until then, we wait, we maintain, and we do our jobs." Caroline asked, What do we say if the Accord contacts us? Lane said we acknowledge receipt and refer all inquiries to the formal diplomatic queue, which no one monitors. Lane looked at her steadily. Which no one monitors, Owen said. Nothing. He had his notebook open but was not writing in it. I said, what do we tell the staff? The truth. We are in a period of reassessment. The petition process has concluded without result. We are adjusting our approach. He paused. No one in this building will be surprised. He was right about that. Accord noticed our absence from the next 2 sessions. The official communications came in on schedule, polite and formal, noting that the human observation seats had been unoccupied and requesting confirmation that the mission remained operational. We acknowledged receipt. We referred all inquiries to the formal diplomatic queue. High Delegate Soren sent a personal communication to Lane on the 6th day. It was 3 sentences. It expressed hope for continued constructive relations. It noted that the Accord valued the human mission's presence at Vareth Prime. It said that dialogue remained the preferred path. Lane read it, filed it, and did not reply. I was monitoring external communications when the first signal came in from Earth Command. That was not a routine update. It came at midnight Vareth time, and it was not sent through the usual diplomatic channel. It came through the military relay, the one that had been quietly operational for 2 years but rarely used. It was a single word: ready. I took it to Lane. He was still awake. He was sitting at his desk, not working, just sitting. He read the word on the screen. He nodded once. All right, he said quietly. I went back to my post. At 4 in the morning I was called to the secondary operations room by Roy Callum, who had transferred from KTH station to the Vareth Prime mission after the attack because he had requested the transfer and Lane had approved it personally. Roy was at his console and he had a look on his face that I recognized from KTH station. Not panic, the opposite of panic, the look of someone who is seeing a very large thing happen and is meeting it with full professional attention. Watch this, he said. He brought up the long-range sensor display. It covered a significant portion of Accord space. Not everything, but enough to see the broad shape of what was happening. 3,112 human ships had decloaked simultaneously across 17 contested sectors. I stood at Roy's console and watched the display update in real time as each signal resolved and was confirmed. They were not concentrated in any one area. They were spread, covering the colony corridors, the transit routes, the 6 stripped by the reallocation decree, the approach vectors toward breath controlled space, positioned patient present. Roy said very quietly, 6 months to move them all in. Silence. During the count I thought of laying at the window with the amber green sky behind him, saying number 14 words to Earth Command. 11 days to go from 71 to 88%. 100% in the dark. 3,112 ships. Is there a broadcast? I asked. Roy pointed to a second screen. It was already running. Not a declaration of war, not a list of demands, a recording. A human voice reading names. 4,759. Names in full, in alphabetical order. Transmitted on all Accord communication frequency simultaneously, the way you read something aloud that deserves to be heard. The broadcast had started 3 minutes before the ships decloaked. Names came before the fleet, that was deliberate, that was the point. The Accord would know before they saw a single ship exactly why this was happening and exactly who it was happening for. I stood in that operations room and listened to a portion of those names being read in a voice I did not recognize, steady, clear, unhurried, name after name after name. Lane came in an hour later. He stood behind Roy and watched the sensor display in silence for a long time. Then he said, "Any response from the Accord?" Roy checked, emergency session being inconvened, multiple delegates requesting floor time, high delegate. Scene has not addressed the chamber yet. The breath. Roy checked a second display. 2 of their 9 ships from the station attack are in Sector 6. They stopped moving 4 minutes after the fleet decloaked. Lane nodded. Owen came in 20 minutes later with a transcript of the emergency session's opening statements. Most of them were variations on alarm, confusion about what was happening, requests for clarification about the status of the human mission, questions about whether this constituted a treaty violation. Though the Accord's own lawyers would spend the next 3 days unable to identify which treaty it violated, given that humans were not members and therefore not bound by the mutual restraint clauses, subject to resource availability as designed. 1. Voice in the emergency session transcript was different from the rest. It was VTH of the Verne. His statement was short. He said, "I advised the chamber 6 months ago that I did not see a manageable situation. I am entering that statement into the record again." Nobody responded to him. I thought about what Lane had told me when I reported my corridor conversation with VTH. Remember that name. 3 hours after the fleet decloaked, Earth Command transmitted the operational orders to the strike force in Sector 5. This was the sector with the highest breadth activity. The 2 ships from Cath Station that had been probing along the Sector 4 boundary for 6 months were in range. The Sector 5 fleet moved. I will be direct about what happened. The way was direct about KATH Station. The Battle of Thern Gate lasted 90 minutes. The human fleet engaged all military targets in the sector with full force and complete precision. No civilian installations were approached. No non-military ships were targeted. The engagement was documented in real time. Every action recorded, every decision logged. It was not brutal, it was thorough. The distinction matters. Brutality is uncontrolled. What the fleet did at Thern Gate was perfectly controlled, which is a different kind of thing entirely, and in some ways harder to understand. Brutality you can explain to yourself as rage. Thoroughness you cannot. Thoroughness means someone thought carefully about exactly what needed to be done and then did exactly that and nothing more. The breath had 9 ships in the region. After 90 minutes they did not. What they had was a communication from the human fleet, transmitted in their own language, translated from a database that Earth Command had quietly compiled over years of monitoring. The communication said, "Your military assets in this sector have been removed. Civilian and non-military operations are not affected. Any further action against human populations in any sector will receive the same response. This communication is being copied to the Galactic Accord and to all major communication relays in Accord space. It was signed with the human spheres. Formal designation, Seoul Collective. Armed Forces Command, not the diplomatic. Mission the Armed Forces, the Accord. Received their copy at the same time as everyone else. High Delegate Soren addressed the chamber 6 hours after the battle. I read the transcript. He was composed, he was measured, he expressed grave concern about unilateral military action in Accord space. He noted that the Seoul Collective's actions constituted a significant escalation. He called for immediate dialogue. He proposed the formation of an emergency response committee which would convene within 30 days. Owen read that part of the transcript and made a sound that might have been a very short, very quiet laugh. He caught himself and stopped. Lane read the full transcript in his office and then sat quietly for a while. He pulled out a sheet of paper and a pen and wrote something on it by hand, which I had only ever seen him do on significant occasions. He folded it, put it in an envelope, sealed it, and handed it to Caroline to transmit. It was Earth Command's reply to the Accord's call for dialogue. I did not see what it said. I found out later from Owen, who had seen the transmission log. It was 2 sentences. The first sentence listed 4 conditions: full Seoul Collective membership with immediate effect, autonomous defense rights in all current human-occupied sectors, a formal accountability proceeding regarding the events at KTH Station, and the establishment of a permanent record, the Accord's official historical archive, to be called the Codex of Reckoning, documenting in full every Accord decision affecting human population since the observer status was granted, including the reallocation decree, the Transit Corridor Act, and the KTH Station attack response. The second sentence read, you have 48 hours to respond with acceptance. The Accord's emergency committee would have needed 30 days just to convene. They had 48 hours. I was at Roy's console when the transmission was confirmed received. Roy watched the acknowledgement scroll across his screen and leaned back in his chair and let out a long, slow breath. There it is, he said. I looked at the sensor display. 3,112 ships patient and present across 17 sectors and positions that had been 6 months in the choosing. There it is, I agreed. Somewhere in Sector 6, the 2 breath ships that had been probing the boundary for 6 were still not moving. Everything was still, the kind of still that comes after a very large thing has happened and the world is deciding what shape it is going to be next. I poured 2 cups of the hot bitter drink and set one in front of Roy. He picked it up without looking at it, his eyes still on the display. The 48-hour clock was running. Nobody in the mission slept much. Nobody needed to. There was too much to watch, and besides, sleep felt like something that belonged to the period before, and this was clearly the period after, and you do not sleep through the period after if you can help it. You pay attention, you pay the closest possible attention, because this is the part you will need to remember. The Accord responded in 31 hours, not 48, 31. They came back 17 hours before the deadline, which told you something about what those 31 hours had looked like inside the chamber. It told you the debate had not lasted long. It told you that the sight of 3,000 ships positioned across 17 sectors combined with a 90-minute record of Thien Gate had shortened the conversation considerably. The response came through the official diplomatic channel addressed to Ambassador Lane personally, bearing the seals of all 47 member delegations. It was not an acceptance, it was a request. For formal talks, it asked that a human representative attend a special session. To discuss the terms, Lane sent back one line: the human delegation will attend. The session was convened 2 days later. It was not held in the main chamber, it was held in the smaller treaty room, which the accord reserved for negotiations of significant consequence. I had never been inside it, I had walked past it many times. It was a round room, with low lighting and a single circular table, no observation gallery, no separate seats to the left, no tables for people who were not quite members. One table, chairs for everyone. Lane went in with Owen Burrell, Caroline Marsh, and me. I want to be honest about how that felt. I want to be accurate. Walking into that room and sitting at that table at the same level as every other delegate, with no glass wall between us and no gallery above us, I do not have a simple word for what that felt like. It felt like something that should have happened 11 years ago, which meant the feeling was relief and anger at the same time, which is not a comfortable combination, but I have found that many true things are uncomfortable. High Delegate Saran opened the session. He looked older than he had 6 months ago. His facial pigmentation was slightly faded, which I had learned from reading about Calvary. Physiology meant stress, not sadness, but the particular metabolic toll of sustained pressure. He spoke carefully. He acknowledged the gravity of the current situation. He said the accord was prepared to enter serious discussion of the terms presented by the Soul Collective. Lane acknowledged him. He thanked him for the expedited session. He said he would take them through the terms. He went through them one by one. He was precise, he was clear, he did not raise his voice, and he did not soften anything. Full membership with immediate effect, autonomous defense rights across all human-occupied sectors, a formal accountability proceeding regarding KTH station to be conducted under a neutral panel including non-accord members, the Codex of Reckoning. On the first 3 terms, the debate was substantial, but not prolonged. The fleet in 17 sectors had done the work that 22 petitions could not. Full membership was accepted by the chamber with 33 votes in favor, 9 opposed, 5 abstaining. The defense rights and accountability proceeding followed in similar fashion. There were objections, there were lengthy speeches. Lane listened to all of them with his hands flat on the table. The 4th term was different. The Codex of Reckoning was the term that took 3 full days to negotiate, not because the accord disputed the facts. Asks were documented and verifiable, but because what the term required was not just acknowledgement, it was permanence. It required the accord to inscribe into its official archive for as long as the accord existed, the complete record of what it had chosen to do and not do, and what had followed from those choices. Several delegates argued that this was punitive, that it looked backward rather than forward, that a new era of relations should begin fresh without the weight of a document that would follow the accord into every future generation. Lane let them speak. He was very good at letting people speak. Then he said, the purpose of the Codex is not punishment. The purpose is memory. Memory of what the accord did and what it cost. Memory of what silence and procedural delay look like when they are applied to people who are being harmed. Memory of the 4,759 Names that were read on a broadcast that preceded 3,000 ships. He paused. Accord is 412 years old. It has made decisions before that it later regretted. It has no formal mechanism for ensuring that those decisions are remembered by the people who come after. The Codex creates that mechanism. He looked around the table. Humanity is not asking the Accord to be ashamed forever. We are asking you to remember there is a difference. The room was very quiet. After that, VTH of the spoke next. His skin was fully deeply blue-green, calm in a deliberate and genuine way. Not the careful composure of someone holding still in rough water. He was calm the way a person is calm when they have been waiting for the right moment to say something, and it has finally arrived. He said, I will second the term. I will vote in favor of the Codex. He looked at Lane when he said it. Lane gave him one small nod, the kind of nod that means I know and I remember. The Codex was accepted on the third day with 26 votes in favor, 18 opposed, 3 abstaining. It was not unanimous. I did not expect it to be. 26 was enough. The signing of the final agreement happened at a separate ceremony, brief and formal. Each delegation's senior delegate signed in turn. The clerk moved around the table. When he reached VTH, the delegate signed first ahead of his place in the rotation. He had asked for the chain, and it had been granted. He signed and set the pen down and looked at Lane. Across the table, I was watching both of them. Lane caught Bates' eye and held it. For a moment, no words. There were no words needed. Two people who had tried to talk to each other in a corridor 6 months ago. One of them with the skin color of careful composure, and the other with her hand pressed against cool composite glass, both of them watching something coming that most people around them were not watching. They had both been right. When Lane signed, I was standing directly behind him. I watched his hand move. He signed his full name in full, which he had told me once he always did on documents that mattered, because abbreviations were for things that did not require your complete attention. After the ceremony, I walked with Owen back through the main building. We passed the corridor with the window. I stopped. Old habit. Amber green sky was doing what it always did. Owen stopped beside me. He had his notebook. He opened it to a new page and looked at it for a moment, then clicked his pen. What are you writing? I asked. The date, he said. He wrote it. Then he looked at what he had written, and maybe one more thing. I looked at the window. I did not ask what the one more thing was because I thought I knew. I thought it was probably something about memory, about how the hardest work is not the dramatic kind. The hardest work is the kind that happens in corridors and common rooms and small offices at 6:00 in the morning by people who write things down carefully and bring reports to the right desks and sit at consoles and stay there for 4 hours and 16 minutes and do not leave. The hardest work is showing up again to the thing that has not started going well yet, because you have decided that stopping is not acceptable. That is what I thought he was writing. I found out years later that he had written they thought silence was submission. It was preparation. I think that is right. The human sphere's formal induction into the Galactic Accord was completed 8 days. After the signing, there was a ceremony. It was attended by delegates from all 47 member species, including the 9 who had voted against full membership. They Attended because the accord required. Attendance at formal induction. Ceremonies, some of them looked like people who had chosen a seat at a table they had not expected to be sitting at. That was fair, I understood the feeling. Humanity had been sitting at a table like that for 11 years now. It was someone else's turn to learn what that felt like. I stood in the main chamber for the induction, not in the observation gallery, not behind a glass wall on the chamber floor with the rest of the human delegation at a table that was the same size as every other table and in the same arc as every other delegation's table and equipped with the same voting interface as every other seat in the room. Lane was at the center of our table. Owen was to his left. Caroline was at the end. Philip Adler, the young Adiz who had pointed out the unenforceability of the protection framework on the night after the reallocation decree, was there too, and Roy Callum, who had transferred from KTH station and spent 6 months at his console in the Verith Prime mission, monitoring and recording and staying at his post. Roy looked at the chamber floor the way a person looks at a place they have been told about for a long time and are finally seeing in person. He looked at it carefully, the way he looked at everything with the thorough, unhurried attention of someone who has learned that the details matter. Helen Marsh was not there. She was still running the medical bay at a new station. She had sent a short message. When she heard the news, it said good. That is all it said. I thought it was exactly right. Lily Kerr, who was 9 years old now, was on a different station with her family who had been relocated after the attack. I do not know if she knew what had happened at Verith Prime. I hope someone told her. I hope someone told her the full story from the beginning, not just the part with the ships. The accountability proceeding for Crustacean began 11 months after the induction. It was conducted under a neutral panel of 7 representatives, 3 of whom were from species outside the accord entirely. The proceeding was open to the public record. It lasted 4 months. Its findings were published in full and as required by the Codex, permanently archived. I testified during the second week. I testified for 3 hours. I told the panel exactly what I have told you. The attack, the 4 hours and 16 minutes, the numbers, the response, the words as designed. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The facts were loud enough on their own. The panel's findings assigned direct responsibility to the regional coordinator for the failures of the protection framework and noted systemic failures at the accord charter level in the drafting of the resource reallocation policy. It called for reforms. Some of the reforms were implemented, some were still being debated years later, which is how institutions process the parts of themselves they find hardest to face. Slowly, with many committees, but the Codex was there. The full record was there in the Accord's own archive under a name that did not soften what it described. It was there for every generation of Accord diplomats and legislators who would come after, available to any researcher, any student, any species curious about what the Accord had once chosen to do with its power. It is there now. I want to tell you something about why the CEX mattered to me personally beyond the obvious reason of justice. It mattered because of what it required the Accord to do with its own history, not to discard it or deny it, but to carry it, to know it forward. Humanity had been carrying our history for as long as we had been writing things down. Every conflict, every failure, every moment. When we had let each other down and had to decide what to do with that knowledge, we were not good at always learning from it, but we were relentless about recording it. We had libraries and archives and memorials and monuments. We had an instinct deep and sometimes inconvenient that said if it happened, it needs to be remembered because the people it happened to deserve that much. We wanted the Accord to have that same instinct, not because we were superior. We were not superior, and I have never believed we were, but we had learned something over our long and frequently painful history that the Accord in its 400-year comfort had perhaps forgotten. The cost of forgetting is always higher than the cost of remembering. The CEX was not a punishment, it was a lesson. The best kind, the kind you are required to keep in the room with you on the day I am finishing this account. I am 41 years old. I am no longer a security consultant. I am the sole collective senior representative to the Accords Joint Security Council, which is a body that did not exist before the induction and was created specifically to integrate human military capability into the Accord's defense framework. It meets twice a month. I sit at a round table with 6 other representatives, and everyone at that table has a vote, and when I speak, no one starts the 9-minute clock. Owen Burrell retired from the diplomatic service 2 years ago. He gave me his notebook on his last day. He had filled every page. I have not read all of it. I have read pieces in the evening slowly. It is an extraordinary document. Every session, every meeting, every conversation in corridors and common rooms and offices at 6:00 in the morning, all of it in that small, careful handwriting. On the last page he had written one sentence: the most dangerous thing in the galaxy turned out to be a species that remembered everything and was willing to wait. Ambassador Lane retired 4 months after the induction, which he had apparently planned all along. He went home to a small house near the coast and grew things in the ground, which he had told me once was all he had wanted to do since he was a child, and which he had set aside for 30 years of diplomatic service. He sends me short messages sometimes. He does not talk about the Accord much. He talks about weather and what is growing. I find I look forward to those messages more than almost anything else that arrives in my communications queue. I think about KTH station every day. I think it is important not to stop. I think it would be easy to let the distance of years soften the edges of it, to let the outcome become the thing I remember instead of the 4 hours and 16 minutes. I do not let that happen. Outcome matters. The outcome is real, and it took enormous effort by enormous numbers of people across a very long time, and I am proud of every part of it. But the 4 hours and 16 minutes are also real, and the 4,759 names are real, and the weight of those names which I carry is not a burden I want to put down. It is the reason the rest of it means anything. You cannot have the outcome without the reason. If you let go of the reason, the outcome becomes just a story about winning, and that is not what this is. This is a story about what happens when a species is told in very clear terms that it does not matter, that its people are expendable, that its grief is manageable, and its patience can be used against it. This is a story about what happens when that species decides, quietly and completely and with full documentation that none of those things are true. The galaxy is a very large place. It has a great deal in it that is extraordinary and strange and beautiful. I have seen more of it in the past 10 years than I expected to see in a lifetime, and I have found that most of what is in it, most of the species, most of the civilizations, most of the minds that have been building and thinking and reaching out across the dark are worth knowing, worth talking to, worth the work of sitting at the same table. But if you sit at a table with us, you sit at a table with all of us, with our history and our grief and our patience and our complete meticulous memory. You sit at a table with the people who ran the evacuation for 6 hours and the people who stayed at the consoles and the people who hid children in maintenance corridors and never gave their names. You sit at a table with 4,759 people who cannot be at the table themselves but whose names are in the archive permanently because the Accord is required to remember them. That is the table. That is what was always on offer. Some species looked at us and saw unpredictability. They saw conflict and noise and the difficulty of something they could not fully model. They saw volatility and called it a liability. They forgot to look at what the volatility was for. They forgot to ask what we were doing with all of that grief, all of that endurance, all of that refusal to stop showing up. They forgot that a species that rebuilds after every disaster, that records every loss, that keeps asking to be included, even after 22 rejections, that species is not fragile. That species is something else entirely. I pressed my hand against a cool window once and watched an alien city glow in an amber green sky and felt something shift inside me. The quiet reclassification of hope into something cooler and more certain. I know what that something was. Now it was the knowledge that we were already enough. We had always been enough. We had just been waiting for the moment to show it, and we had been patient enough and prepared enough and careful enough, and when the moment came, we did not miss it. We did not miss it. That is the end of the account. That is the whole of it, told once as clearly as I know how. I am Mara Vasu's senior representative to the Accord Joint Security Council, former combat sergeant, former security consultant, witness to KTH station, and one of the 14,000 humans who watched a vote that was already over. I have filed this account with the Accord Archive, where it will be stored beside the Codex, where it will be remembered. That is all.